Hi everyone, I'm Martin. Welcome to Donnington Castle Model Railway. Today it's retaining walls and conductor rails. Hi everyone, in today's episode we get stuck into making some progress with the layout after a few recent distractions. Now the biggest priority I have is really getting the track laid for the main lines. The reason for doing that is I can then test that the gradients aren't going to be a problem, which is something I need to fix quite early on. However, in order to do that, I need to finish off the area in this bottom end here with the Southern Main Line and the Heritage Main Line go through their tunnels, because I need to get the top piece for the main lines over the top of those, and that means finishing off the detail inside there. So to that end, we're going to be making some progress on the Southern Main Line, trying to get that bit done. Also, we're going to be working on the scenic area of the Heritage Line, and we're going to be working on the retaining wall. So in today's video, we're going to be using laser cutting. I'm going to talk a little bit about the process involved there, but it's a topic that warrants probably a video on its own, so I'll come back to that in the future and fill in some of the gaps maybe from some of the things that I talk about today. Okay, so let's get stuck right into it. I'll get the camera shifted over and we'll talk about what we're going to do today. Okay, so one of the areas we're going to be focusing on today is continuing this retaining wall here. And rather than talk to you about how I built everything in this area, it's probably easier to talk about some of these components as I build them for other parts of the layout. So today we're going to look at extending this retaining wall, and through that you'll understand a little bit more about how these sections have already been put into place. So if I just pan left, you will see just how much retaining wall is needed on the Heritage Line. So it's going to run all the way along here and then all the way up to past the engine shed up there. Now that's a big run of retaining wall. Now to make it a bit more interesting, I've got some ideas for a little bit further down the layout there, but we'll come back to those another day. What we want to do today is focus on extending the retaining wall a bit further and the process that I use to do that. Now these retaining walls I have designed and built myself, and I'm going to talk you through the process of how I go about that and show you some of the steps involved in that. Okay, so this is a piece of paid-for software called Lightburn, and it's the software that's used to send information to the laser cutter. But we can also use it for designing things as well. Now, I would suggest only using it to design fairly simple things. There are other methods that we can use for design, and I will talk about some of those in other videos. Now, what you can see me doing here is creating some bricks. So a brick is very roughly 1 millimeter high and 3 millimeters wide. So you can see what I'm doing here is I've just created a very simple rectangle of those dimensions and then effectively using the software to tessellate them, and then we can copy and we can then duplicate, and from that we can build up a much larger section of brick wall. Now you'll see here that I've opted for a plain bond. There's nothing to stop you creating an English bond or a Flemish bond or anything or any other pattern like that. But the simplest form is this plain bond here, and if I zoom in you can just make that out. Now that's the technique I use to create a brick pattern that's then set to be engraved by the laser cutter. Now in true Blue Peter style you can see one that I made earlier. And using that same technique, I've created a brick backdrop. I've then effectively created some squares or rectangles of the size that would fit where the retaining walls need to go on my layout. And I've effectively filled them with that brick pattern. I've then created a curve for the arch of the retaining wall, and then I've just put individual bricks, rotating them slowly as we work our way around the curve, in there. Now that may take a little bit of time, but the great thing is we can use this many times. What I then do is I then measure how high each particular section of retaining wall is, and I then effectively add a cut at the bottom of this so that we get exactly the right size of wall each time. There are a couple of extra pieces that fit on. You can see here a patterned front that's going to go on, and then the piece right at the top flips onto the other side, so that's facing the track on the top level. That'll become a bit clearer when I cut the pieces. On the right hand side you can see different settings for the laser cutter. Again, I'll talk about these in a bit more detail in a future video, but you'll see that some of them are set to cut the wood and some of them are set to engrave. So the brick pattern is going to be engraved and then around the outside is going to be cut. And then we've got a couple of extra pieces you can see there in blue that we're going to be using to put over the joints between the retaining walls. So let's get everything cut. Okay, so our retaining walls come off the laser cutter like this. So we have our base piece, which is 2mm basswood. As you can see, we've only engraved the bit that's going to be visible. And then we have this front piece, also made from 2mm basswood, and that's obviously going to fit on the front there. Obviously, because it's been laser cut, they fit exactly, which is great. So what will then also happen is we'll have a piece of, this is 1mm balsa wood, so that will just fit on the top like that. And then to cover the joins between the retaining walls, we've got 1mm card, so there's a bit of flex in it, and we're just going to run that along the edges to overlap between the pieces. Obviously that will be cut down to size. I've not decided whether to also include a section to cover the gaps up the top here. There's also thought about putting some drain pipes on as well, but we'll come back to those at the end, I think. So first stage for all of this is to get it all painted, so we can then think about assembling the bits. I'm going to paint it in Humbrol 77, which is a matte dark blue. The idea being that this is the closest I've really seen to an engineer's blue brick, because that's the look I'm going for around the retaining wall. One question I do have for everyone watching is, do you think there is any need to kind of switch from engineer's blue brick into maybe some older red brick as we get around the retaining wall? Because obviously there's a long run of it there, or do you think that's just going to look weird? I'll leave that to you to offer some thoughts on. Okay, so when we paint in that colour, we're going to end up with something like this. When we get to this stage, we go over it with a matte varnish, and then we'll go over over that to fill in the render between the bricks, but we'll come to that in a second. Our first job is to get these pieces all painted up. So I'll see you when that's done. So just one thing to note when you are painting laser cut wood is that the wood will drink the paint pretty well, so it's actually quite difficult to kind of overcoat. And actually you'll find that because the paint's soaking into the wood very quickly, you might have to go back over this and almost kind of you can always give it a second coat as you're going. One thing I didn't mention is that when we've got our pieces put together, we're then going to put some capping stones along the top. Again, these are just laser cut small pieces of wood, 2mm thick, painted grey. Obviously need a little bit of kind of toning down to make them look a bit more stone-like, but then they're going to go along the top there. But I will keep going with the painting. I will see you shortly. Okay, so that's a few of the bits and pieces, initial coat down on them. We'll come back to those a bit later and just touch them up, because I can already see the paint seeping right into the wood and card. So the process I'm using here is one that I've come up with myself. It's adapted a little bit from the techniques used by Richard at Everard Junction and from Dean at Dean Park. I will put a link up to a great episode of Dean Park that talks, that kind of shows you the entire process of kind of painting and weathering retaining walls using engineers' blue brick. Now the technique that those those two guys I mentioned to use, I think is slightly different because they tend to work with plasticard, so plasticard brick facing, whereas I'm working here with effectively engraved card and wood, and therefore I kind of adapted the process a little bit in order to make this a bit easier. And I think the big difference is getting a really good thick layer of blue paint down first, getting everything covered, because we're then going to effectively seal that in using some varnish, and then go over the top of that varnish in order to add some of to our wash and our weathering. So it's really important that this is a really kind of thick and covering at this point. But I'll move all this to one side and we'll look. Luckily I have a couple of pieces in true Blue Peter fashion that I did earlier, so we'll come on and we'll look at the process of adding some render into this. Okay, so this piece here has been painted and sealed. What we're going to do now is go over the top of this. I'm going to use an acrylic. I think this is light oak, Umbra 103. For me, the colour is not too important as long as it's kind of roughly that kind of rendery, kind of yellowy colour. And what I'm going to do is literally cover this in this paint. Most importantly, getting into all the little cracks. So where the paint's sitting on the surface, just make sure you kind of work that right the way into all the gaps. And you're going to need to give it a good old soaking in order to do that. Okay, hopefully you get the idea. So I will come back when that bit is done. Okay, so I've painted two of these now. It's a good idea to batch these things up, because what we need to do is we need to wait for the paint to dry a little bit before we get on with the next stage. Don't worry too much if you haven't gone into all of the gaps, because at the end of the day this brickwork that we're modelling is going to be, what, 50, 60 years old by the time our layout's set. So there's going to be kind of plenty of kind of chips to the mortar and kind of bits missing, so don't worry too much about coverage. I think I've got a pretty good job on there. Now, when these have started to dry a little bit, we can then start to take the excess paint off the brick faces using a cotton bud, and in this case some acrylic thinners, as I've used acrylic paint. So we just get a cotton bud, dip it in some thinners, and then what you want to do is you want to try and go away from the grain of the bricks. So otherwise, if you go longitudinally and kind of straight up and down, you're going to actually wash the mortar out of the gaps in the bricks. So a diagonal motion, even though that's a little bit fiddly on this piece, is probably the best approach. And if you just see whether we've let it dry enough, you can start to see that blue starting to come through, but with our nice mortar wash still in place. So I'm going to work my way over that. That's going to take, I reckon, about 5 minutes to do that carefully. I'll see you shortly. Okay, so you can see the before and after, hopefully here. So if you find that the surface of the bricks is still a little bit cloudy with the acrylic paint, then you can just get a little bit of towel with a bit of thinners on and just kind of give it a very light wipe over, just to kind of take that top surface off. Now you may find that the blue kind of really pops to start with, but then starts to fade a little bit, and that's kind of where that where you've got kind of a thin layer of paint, kind of thin down paint still on the surface. So that's why that towel can be a good thing, just to dab over it and take some of that off. Okay, so I'm going to get on with the other one. I'll be back in a minute. Okay, so our paint's dried. Happy with the finish on that, given that we're going to go over that anyway. So just glue those in place, bit of wood glue. Using an old paintbrush, I hasten to add. Doesn't need much. Good surface area there. Okay, and just fix those two together. Make sure they're sat square. Luckily, with the laser cutter, we get exact exact match on the sizes. And then let's just weight that down. So all of our pieces are now painted with the mortar wash applied. So we're just going to assemble these. So we have a piece, this piece goes at the top here. Then on the back side we put this and this. And this is going to be what we see from the main line. That's kind of the back, just the back of the top of that wall is going to show. And then I will cut down to size some of this edging, and that's then going to cover the gap between the two sections. So I'll get all that stuck down and then we'll offer it up on the layout. One thing that I will do before putting on the layout is just apply a very basic bit of weathering to it. Now I'm going to come back to the weathering of the retaining walls another time because I need to learn a lot more about how to do that well. But what I will do for now, just to take the edge off things, is use a little bit of panel liner. This is AK panel liner, and I'm going to use a different brush. And all I'm going to do is just work in around the edges. Okay, I'll work my way around the arch. I'll be back in a sec. So from what I understand, there are two principal kinds of weathering on brickwork. One is going to be kind of muck and dirt, which will obviously be darker, and then there's calcification, where I guess for want of a better term, the kind of chemicals and minerals in the water kind of evaporate, the water evaporates off and leaves those behind. So today I'm just going to do some of the darker colours, and so I'll come back and do a proper weathering of all of these when I know a little bit more about it. But I'm just going to use a little bit of weathering powder now, just to streak down as if the rain has kind of carried dirt downwards. So obviously gravity is always the case here, so just going to streak down just to take the edge off some of that very light mortar there. As I say, this is really just to take that edge off for the moment, and so we'll come back over all of the retaining wall sections and do some proper weathering in the future. Okay, and that's all I want to do for now. As you can see, that's just given a little bit of variation to the blue colour of the brick. As I say, not finished. Okay, let's go pop this on the layout. If all the measurements were correct, then hopefully this will fit very nicely into the space. Okay, so here we have our existing retaining wall, and with any luck, this should pop very nicely and neatly into place here, which it does. And then our little covering strip will go in just like that. I'll get some wood glue and get that stuck in place, but now I think we'll move on to something else. Okay, so that's the next piece of retaining wall put in place. We'll now move on to the conductor rail on the Southern Railway. Down this end you will see that the tracks for the Southern Main Line have been laid. They go up and will go into what will be another tunnel. They'll emerge down the bottom end there and then come around to the left and join up at the back over where the station area will be. Okay, so to make progress with laying the main lines, I need to do a little bit of work on this section of layout, which is the southern main line. And the reason for that is I need to get this section done so that this piece of plywood that you can see that's not screwed in place there, that can only get screwed back in place once both the Heritage Line tunnel and the tunnel on the southern line are both complete. So in order to do that, that requires laying, ballasting the track, but also putting conductor rail in place. And today we're going to look at the process of installing the conductor rail that you can see on the right hand side of the shot. So let's go look at how we did that. So our conductor rail is going to be made out of this stuff, code 60 Pico track, and that is going to be on these, I can't remember the code of these, but these are the Pico conductor rail chairs, so the rail just slots through the gaps in these. There are spaces if you're using code 100 track, just to lift those up slightly, but we're using code 75 track here, so we're just going to be using these spaces here. So first job, get the rail cut to the right length, and because we already have one in place on the layout, I'm just going to cut one to exactly the same length. Then we need to make a few tweaks to it, get it painted, and then we can get it installed. Okay, so our conductor rail is cut to the right length. What I want to do now is just put some bends in the end of these, because that's where the shoe kind of comes along and then kind of almost drops off or kind of comes onto the rail via a little incline. So to do that, I don't know if this is the best way, but I'm just going to take a file and just kind of put a little mark on the back here. Probably can't see that on the camera. And then with a pair of pliers, we're just going to bend that ever so slightly down just to create that little tail. Okay, a little bit more. Just put the pliers right by that little score we've made. And then just give that a bit of a twist. Okay. So it doesn't need to be huge, but I don't know if you can pick that up on the camera, but we've just kind of bent that over ever so slightly. Just do the same at both ends. Okay, so put a little bend in either end of that. Now I'm going to paint it in Rail Match Light Rust, with the important bits being the sides of the rail and also the bottom. The top obviously is fairly clear of rust because the conductor shoes are running along there regularly. Okay, so let's get that painted. Okay, so that's most of that rail painted. I'm just going to leave this to dry now. It doesn't need to be particularly good coat. If there are a few patches, it doesn't matter because we're going to blast over this with the airbrush eventually anyway. So as long as we've got the essence of rust, I think that's the important thing. Okay, the paint's dry on our conductor rail, so the best method I've found for this is putting the chairs on at this point and then offering it up on the layout. Now there is an excellent guide that I've been reading up on, and I'll include a link down below in the comments. I need 14 chairs on this section, basically just copying or mirroring the one that I've already put in place, so I know exactly how many I'm going to need. I'll talk through the spacing of those when we get over to the layout. So we just need to cut these off the sprue using some sprue cutters. I find there's no real need to tidy up around the edges. Can't really see any of the imperfection in that cut. The length of that you might just want to trim a little bit off just to make it easier to fit. So you couldn't be able to see this very well on camera, I'd go about there. And then we need to repeat that, so we've got 14 of them. Okay, if I've counted correctly, there are 14 there, and what we're going to do now is slide them on to the end of each rail. I'm going to do 7 from each end, so we're not sliding them up too far. And this is incredibly fiddly process. If you're finding it difficult, just check that you haven't got a burr on the end of your rail where you maybe cut it. Okay, so I found the one thing more difficult than putting these chairs on this rail is putting these chairs on this rail on camera. So I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of them on here. When you do it, you will feel a little bit of resistance, as long as you make sure you've got the rail lined up with the slot. Don't worry about giving it a little bit of force just to pop it on there, just to prise the plastic open. But I'll crack on with this and I'll be back in a minute. Okay, there we go, and that was not a fun job. So I've roughly spaced the chairs out on there. Looking at examples of conductor rail on the southern region, there's obviously lots of different patterns that are used, so I'm not going to get too hung up on that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to have on my line, I'm going to have one conductor chair on the closest sleeper to the end of the rail. I'm then going to have 2 sleeper gap, and then it's going to be a 3 sleeper gap all the way up until the other end where we'll repeat it. So we'll have a 2 sleeper gap underneath between these 2 chairs, and then obviously this on the last sleeper before the end of the rail. But you'll see that a bit better when I put this on the layout for you to see. Okay, so our third rail is going to fit along the outside of this track here. Along most sections of the line, away from stations and things like that, the conductor rail sits on the outside of the track, so that's where we're going to go here. At the end of the rail here, we're actually going to flip to the inside because we go into a tunnel, and I've seen quite a few pictures of tunnels with the conductor rail on the inside. I suspect that's because most of the work that gets done in the tunnel is done on the outside, and obviously you don't want work people too close to that third rail. So we're going to have a gap, a small gap in the conductor rail here, but we'll come back to that another time. Okay, so next job is using the existing conductor rail is just to line up these chairs a little bit better. So I will do that next. Okay, that's a little bit better. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drill the holes for the chairs to sit into. To do that, I'm just going to use a pin vise. I'm going to go right into the end of each sleeper, make a hole. I have no idea what size drill bit this is, I'm afraid. It came out of random assorted bag and it looks about the right size. And this is going to create a little bit of plastic from the sleeper, which we just need to clear away. And what I need to do is I need to go along and do that for all of them. So I'll be back in a minute. Okay, all our holes are drilled now, so we should now be able to offer this up, and depending on how accurately you have lined these up will depend on how easily this now pops into place. This is a very fiddly job, and not another favourite task of mine, as you can see. What I will do is I will just run along this now and try and get everything lined up as quick as well as possible. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to run along these holes with a blob of super glue, and then hopefully just drop this into place. And that is again another fiddly process, so we will see whether that makes the cut or not. Okay, I think we survived no tunnel portals were harmed in the making of this episode. Pop that there. Yeah, so we now have conductor rail on both bits of this main line. Just let the glue finish drying, keep some pressure on that. One thing we will need to do is where we have the conductor rail changing sides, to maintain the current, there is some cable. This is just a little bit of black wire, not sure what thickness, but that feels about the right kind of scale. And so what we do is we're going to attach that to the end of there. I'll need to scrape out a bit of ballast because I didn't think of this beforehand. Run it under the track and then take that around to the new bit of conductor rail that's going to be on the inside. I will do this once I know exactly where that bit of rail is going to be, but hopefully that gives you the idea that I can run under there. Okay, so I think we'll leave the conductor rail there for today. One thing I will just say before we finish up here today is that at the moment it still looks a bit of a mess. That's because we've still got some scenicking to do around here, but also I haven't been over this with the airbrush with any sleeper grime yet. So all of the paint from painting the sides of the rails is still on the top of the rails as well. I don't clean that off until I've finished, because otherwise you're just kind of constantly going over the rails and cleaning them off. So I'll do all that when we, as I say, once we weather that down with the airbrush. But we'll come back to that another time. Okay, I think that's everything you really need to know about installing conductor rail on straight track. As you've seen, it's a little bit fiddly, but this one was certainly easier than the first one, so I think with a bit of practice it gets a bit easier. We may revisit the subject when we get to something slightly different, like maybe curves or point work, but otherwise I think we'll leave that there for today. Okay, now today's been a little bit of a longer episode. Please do leave your thoughts in the comments about whether you like going into the detail like this and it taking a bit longer, or whether you prefer me just to skip over some of that and just focus on the results. I'll be interested to know what your thoughts are. But that about wraps it up for today. Going forwards, I'm probably going to do a layout update and progress video every other video for the next couple of months, because there's some other interesting bits of content that I want to squeeze in between. But I look forward to seeing you back for the next episode. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.